As many? The chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I think most people would say in this country that if you asked on the political divide who the Progressive Liberal Party and the socioeconomic groups, who the PLP represents, most people would say it's the poor. And if you asked who the Free National Movement tends to represent, they would say the business community.
That's your opinion. I am so sorry. You're wrong.
So,
Members,
there was a
members.
There's a story, Mr. Speaker, that my friend Calvin Brown always tells of how this difference is demonstrated in the eyes of the public. And he used to say that this is an interesting country where you go to a political meeting, and at that political meeting, there are Mercedes-Benzes, BMWs, and people dressed up in their fancy clothes, and they're all FNMs, and they're standing up on the platform and saying how terrible the country is. And then you go down the road to the next meeting, the PLP meeting. Everybody had to catch a bus to get there, dragging slippers and a T-shirt, and walk it to get to the meeting. And they're on the platform and saying, what a great country the Bahamas is. So that's the story. That's where I want to begin. That's where I want to begin. I hear the Progressive Liberal Party is now, so the spokesman for the FNM is saying, is passing a tax which he says is going to cause more problems for poor people. And I'm saying that the Free National Movement is not qualified to speak on that subject. Not qualified.
Well, he's a PLD, so...
There's a movie called Casablanca. I love this movie. And in the movie, the character who is the front man for the Germans in Casablanca says, I'm going to round up, there's a murder which takes place. He says, don't worry, I'll solve this murder. I'll go and round up the usual suspects. So as soon as that comes out, or any PLP subject comes out, I can look in the newspaper the next day, and the usual suspects are out there saying, this is bad for the country. Never heard anything that's so terrible. Doom and gloom, we're all going to die. The sky is going to fall down because we pass a VAT tax. So you tend to, having seen these things over the years, you tend to take these things with equanimity. My apologies to Ethric Bow for using a big word. Well, don't worry, it spreads my name around. You see, that's the trick behind this. Yes, right. And then, while the member for North Eleuthera was talking, I was thinking to myself of the mantra, which is the mantra of the Free National Movement. We like it, but not at this time. It's great, but let's not do it now. Let's put it off till next week or next year, so on and so forth. And that's been the case. I heard them taking credit yesterday for the fight to put women in the Independence Constitution. I heard that. But in 1973, they said independence, but not now. National insurance, we agree, but not now. The RBDF, we agree with that, but can't have that. That's Pinling's Army. Not now. National health insurance, well, they managed to beat that one back for 5 years, but I think we're going to get over that. But again, the argument was nice, but not now. So now here we are again. VAT, well, they say they've already, as the lawyers have said, fettered their discretion in this matter because they've announced in advance, ab initio, that's another big word, that they are going to vote no. So this should be a very short debate. The member for North Eleuthera has now stated their position, and there's no part of no that we don't understand, and so we can wrap this all up by nighttime. Right? No, well, the leader of the opposition made a public statement and said that they would oppose VAT. They would oppose VAT. Now, Mr. Speaker, any tax which you seek to implement will have problems. It's just a tough thing to do. If I'm correct about the American experience, because some have argued that we should introduce income tax. And one of the reasons that I've opposed income tax, notwithstanding the argument they say that it is more progressive than regressive, and therefore a better tax, is I don't like, and one of the reasons I don't want to live in the United States is it's too many rules, too intrusive, the bureaucracy is all up in your business, that's none of their business, and so I just don't support that. But my recollection is, and you can check the history books about this, that income tax was introduced in the United States during the Civil War in the U.S. And it was then 0.5%. And the argument was that this was only being implemented for to pay for the war. And after the war was finished, it would disappear. Of course, we now know it's 2014, and most people are paying, what, 33% on their annual income. So from 0.5%, it's now up to 33%, and the code is about this big, and you can't understand anything in it, and it chips around the edges. This is out, that is out, the next is in, that is out, so on and so forth. Right. Was it? Whatever. The fact is, it began as a small tax, was only supposed to be there for a while, and now it's still there, and I don't know, 30 times what it started off at. And the bureaucracy is enormous to be able to police it. Now, talk about regressive. The present tax system is regressive, where everybody is paying, on average, if I'm correct, 33% on every good that you purchase. Every good that you purchase has that added into it. As a matter of fact, when we were arguing on the CSME debate, we were talking about the fact that there was a disadvantage to people who were there was an advantage to people in the services sector, because the taxes were so far and wide apart between what was applied to services as applied to someone with goods. So if you if you were a merchant, and you wanted to go into business, in order to put that good on the shelf, you essentially had to have 150% of the cost of the good just to put the thing on the shelf. All right. So that's 150%. That means added bank charges, so on and so forth. And then the person who's in the services, that is the lawyer, the doctor, the Indian chief, lawyers, accountants, engineers. And the interesting thing about them is that many of them received an education from this country which was totally subsidized from the day they stepped into the school till the time they left university. And when they came back home, sorry? Exactly. And that was a good thing. That was a good thing. But the society needs to be able to find a way to get its money back, or to have some contribution from those persons who got from the society. So the idea is there ought to be some equality in what is applied to goods, the person who sells goods, and what is applied to services, so that services come into the net. That's one of the arguments. But as I say, it's not an easy choice. And there are arguments on either side. There's good and bad. The problem is that someone has to decide what kind of tax is going to be, and at some point we have to make a decision to do it. The first time I heard about this question of VAT as it applied to the Bahamas, because I used to sit here. I've been coming in and around this place since I was a reporter in the 1970s, those long debates. And it always fascinated me every year that the government would do these borrowing resolutions as soon as the debate was finished. You'd have these long resolutions borrowing money to make up the shortfall that we've been running. Someone's gone back to 1993, but I'm certain it's way back into the 70s that we've been trying to make up the shortfall every year with this borrowing. And it's just added up and added up and added up. Anyway, John Roll, who's now the financial secretary, we used to have at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs these sessions with civil society. And one of the times he came, just before he went to do, I believe he went to do his PhD, he came and he said this: the tax system of the Bahamas cannot pay for the costs of running the services of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. This was back in 2003, 2004. Said, if we do not do something about this, we are looking at a sea of red ink into the future, which cannot be good for the country. And I think he put forward the question of value-added tax back then. I'm sure that was not the first time the idea was posited, but that's the first time that I heard it put in a formal setting. I am sometimes perhaps too quick a study, and I said, great, let's go after that. Now, several governments have passed since then, and there have been several studies done. One of them was done by a group called the Crown Agents. And the Crown Agents, I believe that was during the time that we were in office, 2002, 2007. And they made a study. And again, the study said, I believe the study may have in fact predated our coming to office, that we met the study that was done. So that means if that's the case, it was actually done by the prior administration. And they said, let's go for VAT. That was their advice. I believe that advice had been accepted by the other side as the way to go. And all efforts, as far as I knew, certainly from what I heard from James Smith, the Minister of State, may even have announced that value-added tax was going to come within a couple of years of that time.
Very well. Member yields. The chair recognizes the honourable member for Long Island.
Second time I am rising in this House to refute these erroneous, misleading claims by the governing side with regards to this administration having any concrete plans to put in place value-added tax. And furthermore, I challenged them the last time it was said in here to bring the yellow paper. It matters not to me what happens in a ministry. Ministries do lots of work. Very little of that work ever makes it to cabinet. So it does not matter what they did in the Ministry of Finance. Until it actually came to cabinet and had an official discussion, that never happened under our administration. I would like for the record to reflect that. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Very well, honourable member.
So the record,
Member for
Mr. Speaker,
Foxton.
reflects it. The problem is, in my response, that it's a distinction without a difference. The point I'm making is this. It is a distinction without a difference. What it means is, what I will then argue is this. The fact is, there is a bureaucracy that gives advice to governments. Ministers of finance accept advice, papers are generated, ideas are generated. The fact is, we have been going in the direction of value-added tax under both administrations, even if you never made a formal decision. The papers were generated out of the Ministry of Finance. There's no question about it. No question about it.
Members?
There's no question about it.
Members?
We've been
members?
going in this
Honourable
direction.
members? Honourable members? Member for Foxhill?
Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the fact is we have to find ways to raise additional revenue. And the question is, out of all of the ranges of options that are available to us, this is where we have gotten the best advice as to the way forward. And that is why we find ourselves here today. Now, the
Members,
perhaps I
member for Fox Hills,
yeah
continue to
perhaps I
address the
need
chair.
to. One of the members from her side, from the side of the member, that we needed protections. And so perhaps I need to ask his aid and comfort to silence the noise on the other side.
Member for Long Island, the chair will ask that you manage your extraneous remarks from your seat. Member for Fox Hill, you may continue.
Thank you, and I will continue. Now, so I talked about the Crown agents. Now, the opposition talks about how expensive this is going to be for poor people, or for people, and the expense which it's going to add. There's something which the economists often argue, and this is an effect which it has, and any tax will have once it's applied once the government implements a tax. One effect is something called the income effect, and the other effect is called a substitution effect. In both of these cases, what it says is that, yes, there may be some effect on demand, on income, and so forth in the short term, but in the long term, you will find adjustments to both income by way of substitution and demand by way of substitution. So there may be some short-term impacts, but in the long term, there is a recovery. The fact is that has to be done. You have to make the decision now, the difficult decisions. And this is the issue, the point at which we're at. There's a lot of heavy lifting the Progressive Liberal Party has to do this year. It's a really tough thing for a government to do. Taxes are never popular. Change is never easy or popular. But some things are the right thing to do. The IMF came here in our first term. They did a study. And they talked about, they looked at two things. The question of Bahamians' attitudes toward paying taxes, and they also looked at the attitude of those who have to administer the collection of taxes. And when they went around to the people who paid the taxes and asked them what did they think about the tax regimes of the Bahamas, and, for example, why they didn't pay taxes where they didn't have to pay those taxes. One of the things if you want to call them the consumer of the tax, said, people who pay the taxes or refuse to pay the taxes, as the case might be, is they said they could not see a connection between the taxes they paid and the benefits which they obtained from the taxes they paid. In fact, some of the more well-to-do neighborhoods, I used to question this myself. For example, you'd go into, at one point, I don't think it exists now, you go into a neighborhood like Winton, where there are high property tax values and no street lights. But you go to Elizabeth Estates and there's street lights on every corner where the tax values are low. So you would see that a taxpayer would say to themselves, well, you know, that there's no connection between the two. That's what the IMF discovered. And then when they went to those who were administering the taxes, they said, well, why aren't taxes collected in the Bahamas? And they were said, well, there's not a culture here of collecting taxes. You know, in the United States, it's a great moral, you've befallen some moral law in the U.S. if you don't pay a tax. Over here, well, if you don't pay the tax, same thing. But what they suggested is that we needed to do some public education to show that there is a connection between the taxes you pay and the services you receive from the government. And their view was that if you did sufficient public education on this point, that people may be more engaged in the need to pay their taxes. So clearly, with regard to the implementation of this particular tax, that has to be one of the jobs which the government has to have itself engaged in. The question of public education on the whole business of tax policy, of paying taxes, in addition to the specific things related to this tax. What makes some of the objections to this laughable, all of the doom and gloom that's being preached on the subject, is that, and I think it's been mentioned here before, we go to Miami, a favorite spot for bang. And you walk into the shop, you buy the good, and I don't know what the tax is in Miami. 6 or 7%. It's tacked onto the bill, and it's a sales tax, and people pay it and don't think anything of it. In fact, even though some people say that they don't actually understand why people go shopping in Miami, because when you add up all the expense of the trip, the hotel, the car, the this, the that, in fact, it equates to what you would spend if you just bought the good here in Nassau. But there's a psychic value which is attached to the trip to Miami. So it's an experience for people. The reason I mention that is because at the end of the day, for the consumer of a good or a service, that is the only thing that that person needs to concern himself about, which is the only thing that will happen that's different from the present shopping experience now is the same experience you have in Miami. 7.5% gets tacked on to the bill. That's the only thing. To get up and try and explain all the arcane procedures about this and that and so on and so forth, to me, is just frightening people unnecessarily. Because the experience will be seamless at the counter. You go to the counter, pay for the good, the consumer pays. All the rest of this is for the specialized people and the specialty experience. And that experience, the training, the education, all of that will be supplied by the Ministry of Finance. There's a registration process, which I'm advised is to begin on the 1st of September for businesses over a particular volume of business. 100,000, I believe, is the floor. And those businesses will register, and there'll be training sessions as to how it works in practice. But for most of us, the people who actually go to the counter, it will be a seamless experience. In fact, the member for North Eleuthera was talking about Barbados. It also exists in Antigua and in St. Lucia. I was speaking to someone from Antigua a couple of weeks ago, and I asked them, young man, I said, do you pay VAT in Antigua? Answer, yes. How much is the VAT? And he looked up in the sky. He couldn't remember. Yeah, and the fact is, after a while, this is what I mean by the substitution effect. After a while, it just becomes part of the normal transaction. And so there's no point in us, spreading fear and scaremongering people about what this is going to bring. At the end of the day, the expectation is that this will put our finances on a sounder footing, that we will have more funds to be able to do the things which people demand. The schools need to be fixed and upgraded and built. Teachers have to be paid. Hospitals have to be equipped. I mean, there's an endless set of a list, which is endless, of things that we have to have money for. And on the other side, we have to compensate whatever it is we're asking the Bahamian people to pay with greater efficiencies and better management and administration of the tax dollars which are collected. We have to choose, or have had to choose, make a bad set of choices about which tax. We'd prefer not to have to impose any tax at all. Life would be great if it would just be tax-free. But unfortunately, there has to be some form of tax. And the best advice we have is that this will provide the best of the alternatives that are available to us. After this, Mr. Speaker, we have one more, in my view, bit of heavy lifting to do, and that's the gaming bill. We will vote next week on the bills to amend the Constitution. Then, the member for North Eleuthera talked about being on the ground. And I repeat something I said yesterday. People may think the Progressive Liberal Party is some organization that you just toss around like chaff in the wind. But when the Progressive Liberal Party gets cranking and the wheels start turning, you will see what a juggernaut does in this country. And that's not a threat. That's a promise. That's a promise. We need the organization will get itself organized as it is now, having done the heavy lifting, and be able to say we have done a set of programs and policies which we think will put this country on the forward movement toward more and greater progress. And, Mr. Speaker, we are able to say that we have done heavy lifting in the past. We have a record. And we also know that that record has been opposed by those who even say, "Child, please." And we have overcome on every occasion. On every occasion. I said, Mr. Speaker, to those who are going wobbly at the moment, that when you look at 2012, 53% of the country supported the other side, plus the DNA that didn't make it in here. So don't be surprised if 53% make more noise than 47. But that's only for now. The question hasn't been put yet. And the way our system works, nothing counts till the question has been put. And when the question is put, we shall see. We shall see what happens. And what it requires, Mr. Speaker, is discipline, faithfulness, loyalty, trust. And this side is united in the hard and heavy lifting that has to be done, united, absolutely together, in our complete dedication to the good of the Bahamian people, rich, poor, and in between. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't want anyone to lose heart. I don't want anyone to lose heart. These programs are tough to accept, but they are for the better good. It's something which, of course, we have to explain, something which we have to have a teaching role. I heard that one businessman announced that if VAT comes, he's going to close down all his shops. And I thought to myself, well, That's interesting because I know a lot of young entrepreneurs who would see immediately that there's a vacuum in the market that they can fill. So if the shop closes, then, others come in. That's the way of life. But this country, sir, in my view, is going to progress. We have the best educated generation the country's ever produced coming after us. Smarter, better than us, and we help to make them so. So I have every confidence in what comes in the future. But what we're going to do is, while we are here at the wheel, we're going to make sure that the foundation is laid for this country to go on to greater heights. So, yes, we may have some moments of discomfort. Yes, there may be some disagreements with the tax policy. But those who sit now have to take the best advice which is possible. And so I commend this bill to the Bahamian people, as I think it is in the best interest of them to adopt it. Thank you, sir.